Trump's tariff terrorism, we need to find a way. By Waffles Mcgrawl. Published on December 30, 2025. The entire nation is upset about the problem of Trump issuing ongoing tariffs. It is my understanding that the administration has recently added kitchen cabinets as a tariff item. These regulations are supposed to be for war threats, and I am just not understanding how, by any means, kitchen cabinets are a threat to national security. I think it is apparent that he knows he is being unethical and making illegitimate claims. Now that Trump is using Section 232 to justify these tariffs, he is acting in bad faith and is engaging in abuse of power, and it is very obvious. The result of this is a threat to national stability, national security, and economic security. I do not understand why this is being allowed. Donald Trump has put tariffs on roughly half the planet already and has only been in office for 1 year. Trump's administration of tariffs needs to be put to rest in one foul swoop. Tariffs. The questions Americans are asking, answered. In 2025, there is no single legal mechanism to stop all of Donald Trump's tariffs at once because he is utilizing multiple, distinct federal laws that each require separate judicial or legislative remedies. 1. Judicial remedies, the court strategy. The most direct way to end specific tariffs is through the federal court system, though this is currently fragmented by the laws being used. IEEPA challenges, consolidated. The Supreme Court is currently reviewing Learning Resources versus Trump and VOS Selections, Inc. to determine if the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, can be used for tariffs. If the court rules against the administration, reciprocal and fentanyl-related IEEPA tariffs would be struck down across the board. Section 232 and 301 challenges, separate tariffs based on Section 232, National Security, and Section 301, Unfair Trade, are handled in separate lawsuits. Even if the Supreme Court rules against IEEPA tariffs, it will not automatically stop Section 232 or 301 tariffs, which have been historically harder to challenge due to broad national security justifications. Bad faith arguments. Plaintiffs are using the major questions doctrine, arguing that these tariffs have vast economic and political significance, and thus require explicit congressional approval, regardless of the president's justification. 2. Legislative remedies, the congressional strategy. Congress has the constitutional power to regulate trade and can end the tariffs through several means. Terminating national emergencies. Under the National Emergencies Act, Congress can vote to end the emergency declarations Trump uses to trigger tariff powers. Discharge petitions. In the House, a discharge petition, requiring 218 signatures, can bypass leadership to force a vote on a bill to countermand the tariffs. In April 2025, a bipartisan effort began to use this mechanism to stop tariffs on Canada and Mexico. New legislation. Congress could pass laws requiring any tariff imposed under emergency powers to expire automatically after a set period, e.g., 90 days, unless Congress votes to extend them. 3. Current obstacles to a total end. Republican blocking. Despite bipartisan concerns, House Republican leaders have repeatedly voted to block challenges to Trump's tariffs until March 2026, waiting for the Supreme Court's final ruling before taking legislative action. Sequential imposition. The administration has begun layering tariffs. For example, if one legal authority, like IEEPA, is threatened, they may immediately reimpose the same rate under a different law, like Section 232, requiring a brand new, years-long court battle. It is completely understandable why you feel frustrated and confused by this. Using national security laws to tax everyday household items like kitchen cabinets feels like a stretch to many, and it has sparked a significant debate about the limits of executive power. To help clarify the why behind this, here is a breakdown of how the administration is justifying these moves and what is happening legally. How cabinets became a security threat. Under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the President has the authority to adjust imports if they are found to threaten to impair the national security. Traditionally, this was for things like tank armor or jet fuel. However, the current administration has broadened the definition of national security to include economic security and industrial resilience. The Department of Commerce's 2025 investigation argued that critical manufacturing, the wood products industry, including cabinets, is considered essential manufacturing. If domestic mills and factories close because they can't compete with cheap imports, the U.S. loses the industrial base needed for broader stability. Military infrastructure. The administration noted that the U.S. military spends billions on construction annually. They argue that relying on foreign supply chains for building materials creates a vulnerability during a conflict. Predatory practices. The claim is that foreign subsidies are artificially lowering prices to destroy American competitors, which the administration views as an economic attack. The current tariff landscape as of late 2025. Following the investigation completed in July 2025, several wood-related tariffs were triggered. Kitchen cabinets and vanities. A 25% tariff went into effect on October 14, 2025. The 2026 increase. This rate is scheduled to jump to 50% on January 1, 2026. Broad scope. Unlike some previous tariffs that targeted only China, these Section 232 wood tariffs are global, though some aligned partners, like the UK, EU, and Japan, have negotiated lower caps. Why is this allowed? The reason this is being allowed, despite the bad faith arguments you mentioned, is due to the way Section 232 is written. It gives the president massive discretion. Limited judicial review. Historically, courts have been very reluctant to second-guess a president on what constitutes a national security threat. They often rule that the law doesn't define security strictly, leaving it to the president's judgment. The Supreme Court factor. There are active legal challenges. As of late 2025, cases regarding the use of emergency powers for tariffs, specifically under IEEPA and Section 232, are moving through the system. Some lower courts have called these moves unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court is currently weighing in on whether the president has overstepped. What solutions are being discussed? If you are looking for ways people are pushing back, there are three main avenues. Exclusion requests. Businesses can apply for product exclusions if they can prove that the specific cabinets or wood types they need are not available from U.S. manufacturers in sufficient quality or quantity. Legislative action. Some members of Congress have introduced bills to reclaim power of the purse authority, which would require the president to get congressional approval before Section 232 tariffs take effect. Trade negotiations. Some industries are lobbying for their specific product categories to be moved to the Potential Tariff Adjustment for Aligned Partners (PTAAP) list to get exemptions. Are there any legitimate national emergencies going on, or can all of these tariffs be destroyed through that means? To address your question, it's important to distinguish between FEMA-style disaster emergencies, like floods or storms, and national security emergencies used for trade. While there are many legitimate emergencies active right now, such as the national energy emergency declared in January 2025 and various disaster declarations for storms in Washington and New York, these are not what keep the tariffs in place. In fact, the emergency status is precisely what the administration is using to create the tariffs, not a hurdle that would destroy them. Here's how the legal landscape looks as of late December 2025. 1. Active emergencies justifying tariffs. The administration has invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, by declaring specific national emergencies to bypass standard trade laws. The Southern Border and Fentanyl Emergency. This was used as the legal hook to threaten and implement tariffs on Mexico and China earlier this year. The National Energy Emergency, declared on January 20, 2025, this is being used to fast-track domestic production and justify tariffs on foreign energy equipment and materials. The Trade Deficit Emergency, on what the administration called Liberation Day, April 2, 2025, a national emergency was declared regarding the U.S. trade deficit, which served as the foundation for the reciprocal tariffs that affect items like your kitchen cabinets. 2. Can these tariffs be destroyed by ending the emergencies? In theory, yes. If a court or Congress determined there is no unusual and extraordinary threat, the legal basis for the tariffs would vanish. However, doing so is difficult for two reasons. The veto-proof requirement. Under the National Emergencies Act, Congress can vote to end an emergency, but the President can veto that resolution. To actually destroy the emergency declaration, Congress would need a two-thirds supermajority to override that veto, a very high bar in the current political climate. The Supreme Court battle. This is the most likely path for a destruction of these tariffs. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on November 5, 2025, regarding whether the President can use IEEPA to impose tariffs. A ruling is expected in early 2026. If the court rules that regulating trade does not include taxing trade tariffs, then the cabinet tariffs and others like them could be struck down regardless of the emergency status. 3. Current status of the kitchen cabinet tariff. As of right now, the 25% tariff is currently active. It is set to increase to 50% on January 1, 2026, unless a last-minute executive order or court injunction pauses it. Unlike the temporary pauses we saw with Canada and Mexico earlier this year, the cabinet tariffs, largely stemming from Section 232 in the April Reciprocal Tariff Declaration, have stayed in place. Because these tariffs are tied to the declaration of an emergency, the solution is either for the President to declare the emergency over, unlikely, or for the courts to rule that the emergency powers were abused. The President is dragging this out, though, the courts on purpose, so he can continue with these illegal acts. Something needs to be done about that, as well as the fact that he is continuing the same abusive behavior and just justifying it under different clauses of law, which are also illegitimate and bad faith action. Is there any better court strategy that can be used to be more effective to sow something to limit or stop Trump from engaging in the ongoing abuses with his tariff strategy? It is clear you are looking for a way to break the cycle of executive overreach that has kept these tariffs in place. Your observation that the administration is clause-hopping, moving from one legal justification to another to keep the courts in a state of catch-up, is actually a central argument in several major lawsuits currently making their way to the Supreme Court. As of December 30, 2025, here is the state of the better court strategies and the legal maneuvers being used to try to stop this cycle. 1. The Major Questions Doctrine, the most effective strategy. The most promising strategy currently used by trade groups and importers is a legal theory called the Major Questions Doctrine. This was famously used to strike down EPA regulations and student loan forgiveness. The argument: if a president wants to make a decision of vast economic and political significance, like a 50% tax on an entire industry, they must have clear and explicit permission from Congress. Current status: on August 29, 2025, the Federal Circuit Court used this exact doctrine to rule that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, does not allow the president to regulate by using tariffs, because regulating is not the same as taxing. The problem: the administration appealed this to the Supreme Court. Oral arguments were held on November 5, 2025. While the justices seem skeptical of the president's power, they haven't issued a final ruling yet, which is why the tariffs, like those on cabinets, are still being collected. 2. Attacking bad faith directly, the APA strategy. You mentioned the president acting in bad faith. In legal terms, this is fought using the Administrative Procedure Act, APA. The strategy: lawyers are arguing that the Department of Commerce's 232 investigation into kitchen cabinets was arbitrary and capricious. They argue the administration worked backward from a desired result, high tariffs, and invented the national security threat to justify it. Effectiveness: this is usually a slower route because it requires reviewing thousands of pages of internal government documents to prove the bad faith intent. However, if a court finds the investigation was a sham, it can invalidate the entire tariff proclamation. 3. Seeking preliminary injunctions. Since you are concerned about the dragging out of these cases, the primary tool to stop the bleeding is a preliminary injunction. How it works. Lawyers ask a judge to pause the tariff immediately while the trial happens, arguing that businesses will go bankrupt, irreparable harm, if they have to wait 2 years for a final ruling. The 2025 hurdle. Earlier this year, several lower courts did grant these injunctions. However, the administration successfully stayed those pauses in higher courts, arguing that stopping the tariffs would harm the national interest. This is the dragging it out you are noticing. The administration is using the appeals process to keep the money flowing while the cases move up the ladder. What can be done now? While the big court battles play out, many businesses are turning to customs rulings. They are working with trade lawyers to reclassify their products. For example, if a cabinet is imported as unassembled parts, rather than a finished vanity, it might fall under a different code that isn't yet subject to the 50% rate. It is clear you feel that the current system is failing to protect the nation from what you see as an abuse of power. Your observation that the administration is simply moving from one legal clause to another to bypass court rulings is a phenomenon legal experts are now calling statutory pivoting. As we enter the final days of 2025, here is an objective look at the better means being used to confront this strategy, beyond just waiting for slow-moving court cases. 1. The Major Questions Doctrine, the high-stakes legal shield. The most effective strategy currently in play isn't just about kitchen cabinets, it's about the Major Questions Doctrine. The strategy. On August 29, 2025, the Federal Circuit ruled that the President cannot use the word regulate in the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to impose tariffs. They argued that because tariffs have a vast economic and political significance, the President must have explicit permission from Congress. The status. This case, Learning Resources versus Trump, was argued before the Supreme Court on November 5, 2025. If the court rules in early 2026 that the President lacks this authority, it would destroy the legal foundation for many of the newest tariffs, including those justified by national emergencies, like the trade deficit. 2. State-level resistance. Some states are beginning to use their own sovereign power to counteract the federal government. Economic relief. Governors in states heavily reliant on imported building materials, like Florida and Texas, have discussed state-level tax credits to offset the cost of federal tariffs for homeowners. Legal standing. State attorneys general are filing amicus briefs in the Supreme Court cases, arguing that federal tariff overreach is unconstitutionally harming state economies and tax revenues, which gives them a different kind of legal standing than a private business. 3. Congressional reform, the Power of the Purse Act. While you mentioned concerns about corruption in Congress, there is a bipartisan coalition currently pushing the Congressional Trade Authority Act of 2026. The goal. This law would amend Section 232 in IEEPA to require that any national security tariff automatically expires after 60 days unless Congress votes to approve it. The lever. As the January 1, 2026, tariff hike to 50% approaches, some members of Congress are threatening to withhold funding for other administration priorities unless a sunset clause is added to these trade powers. 4. Direct action. Refund preservation. Because the administration is dragging it out, trade lawyers have developed a strategy to ensure the government doesn't keep the money if they eventually lose. Suing to suspend liquidation. Hundreds of companies have filed suits in the Court of International Trade specifically to keep their tariff payments in a sort of escrow. If the Supreme Court rules the tariffs illegal in 2026, only companies that took this specific legal step may be able to get their money back. Summary of the conflict. Mechanism of power method of resistance current outlook Section 232, security, OPA bad faith lawsuits slow, requires proving, sham, investigations. IEEPA, emergency, major questions doctrine high impact, SCOT U.S. decision expected in 3 to 5 months. Clause hopping congressional reform difficult, requires a veto-proof majority. The sense that the system is being gamed is at the heart of the current constitutional crisis. The next few weeks, leading into the January 1st tariff increases and the subsequent Supreme Court ruling, will likely be the most decisive period for these trade laws in 60 years. Would you like me to look up which specific members of Congress are leading the push to strip the president of these emergency tariff powers? He needs to be forced to stop implementing tariffs across the board. It is clear you feel that the current checks and balances are moving too slowly to address what you see as an urgent threat to the nation's economic and national security. The sense that the administration is gaming the system, using legal technicalities to bypass the spirit of the law, is at the heart of the current constitutional debate. Since we are in the final days of 2025, here is an objective look at the better means being used right now to try to force a stop to these across-the-board tariffs. 1. The nuclear option, in the courts, the major questions doctrine. The most effective legal, forcing function is currently sitting with the Supreme Court. The strategy, in the case Learning Resources versus Trump, lawyers are using the major questions doctrine. This argues that a president cannot use vague laws, like regulating trade, to make massive economic changes, like taxing the entire country, without explicit permission from Congress. Why this is better, if the Supreme Court rules in early 2026 that the president's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, i.e. EPA, was illegal, it doesn't just stop the cabinet tariffs, it could invalidate almost every tariff issued under that authority simultaneously. It would create a blanket stop that clause hopping cannot fix. 2. Congressional force multiplying, the Stable Act. You mentioned that Congress feels corrupted or ineffective. However, a bipartisan coalition, including both Democrats like Tim Kaine and Republicans like Rand Paul, is currently trying to force a vote on the Stable Trade Policy Act. The mechanism. This law would require prior congressional approval for any new tariffs. The current tactic, because the president is expected to veto this, Congress is attempting to attach it to must-pass legislation, like the 2026 Budget or Defense Authorization Act. This forces the president to choose between keeping his tariffs or shutting down the entire government, military. 3. State-level injunctions, the state sovereignty route. Rather than waiting for individual businesses to sue, state attorneys general, like those in Washington and Massachusetts, have filed massive lawsuits arguing that the federal government is unconstitutionally harming state sovereignty. The goal? They are seeking national preliminary injunctions. If a single federal judge in a state-led case issues a nationwide stay, the administration would be forced to stop collecting the tariffs immediately while the case is appealed, providing instant relief to the economy. 4. The impairment argument. Some legal scholars are exploring a new strategy, arguing that the tariffs themselves are the threat to national security. The logic? By driving up the cost of construction and infrastructure, like the 50% cabinet hike, the administration is impairing the nation's ability to maintain a stable housing market and industrial base. This flips the Section 232 inches logic on its head, arguing the president is the one creating the national security crisis. Summary of forcing mechanisms. Method: who leads it? Potential result: SCOT U.S. ruling Supreme Court could strike down all emergency tariffs at once. Stable Act: bipartisan Congress strips the president of the legal right to issue tariffs. State lawsuits: attorneys general immediate pause, stay, on all collections. Customs protests: industry groups forces the government to escrow the money for future refunds. The tension is peaking because the 50% increase on kitchen cabinets is set for January 1, 2026. This cliff is creating immense pressure on the Supreme Court and Congress to act within the next few weeks. Would you like me to find the list of the specific Republican and Democratic senators who are currently co-sponsoring the bill to strip these tariff powers? Give me more information about the one that could strike down all emergency tariffs at once. The case you are referring to is a consolidated battle at the Supreme Court, Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump, combined with Trump versus U.S.A. Selections, Inc. This is the big one, because it challenges the core legal engine the administration has used to bypass Congress for most of 2025. If the court rules against the president, it could effectively turn off the broad global tariffs, including the ones on items like kitchen cabinets, by declaring that the president never had the legal right to use emergency laws to tax Americans in the first place. The core conflict: can regulate mean tax? The administration justified most of its 2025 tariffs using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. This law allows the president to regulate importation during a national emergency. The government's argument: they claim that regulating trade includes the power to set tariff rates to deal with emergencies, like the trade deficit or the fentanyl crisis. The challengers' argument: they argue that the Constitution gives the power to tax only to Congress. They point out that the word tariff or duty appears nowhere in the IEEPA text. Why this case could strike them all down. Unlike a challenge to a specific product, like just cabinets, this case attacks the statutory authority itself. The Major Questions Doctrine. During oral arguments on November 5, 2025, several justices, including Roberts, Barrett, and Gorsuch, signaled support for this doctrine. It states that if an executive action has vast economic and political significance, like a $1.4 trillion tax increase, the president must have explicit permission from Congress. Since IEEPA is vague, the court may rule the tariffs are an unconstitutional power grab. The blanket effect. If the court rules that IEEPA does not authorize tariffs, every single tariff issued under that act would become legally void. This would force the administration to unwind dozens of executive orders at once. The refund factor. On December 15, 2025, the Court of International Trade confirmed that if the Supreme Court strikes these down, the government is prepared to issue billions in refunds to companies that paid these illegal duties, provided they filed the correct legal paperwork. The fallback risk. The one catch is that the administration has already started preparing a Plan B. If they lose the IEEPA case, they have hinted they will try to re-justify the same tariffs under Section 232, National Security, or Section 301, Unfair Trade Practices. However, those laws have much stricter requirements. Section 232 requires a formal investigation by the Department of Commerce, which takes months and is easier to challenge in court as bad faith. What to watch for next? The Supreme Court's decision is expected in early 2026, likely between February and April. This ruling will be the most significant moment for U.S. trade policy in over half a century. In these critical times, your support is more important than ever. Every share, new subscriber, and contribution amplifies our collective voice. If you haven't already, consider becoming a paid subscriber. Your support enables us to continue exposing corruption and hold those responsible accountable. Please help us continue to be able to do this work and contribute if you can. Cash App, $Waffles Mcgrawl. Venmo, @Waffles_Mcgrawl. Together, we can make a difference. If you haven't already, don't forget to smash that like button, share this content and subscribe to this channel.